All right. Welcome to Radiator Comics Studio's first presentation of our new series, Nuts and Bolts. My name is Neil Brideau. My pronouns are he, him, his, and I run Radiator Comics, which distributes handmade and small press comic books, zines, and graphic novels. Radiator Comics Studio is a series of programs and publications that we're producing to support and grow the community of cartoonists here in South Florida. This program is made possible with support from the John S. and James L. Knight Foundation, and we're grateful for their support, as well as the support of Oolite Arts and the Miami Foundation. Radiator Comics Studio is intended to be a venue for South Florida residents who are interested in comics, regardless of their experience level, to come together and grow our community. And because of that, I wanted to take a moment to acknowledge the land that we live and work and create on, and acknowledge the indigenous people who have been and continue to be the caretakers of this land. Here in Miami, we live on land of the Miccosukee and Seminole tribes. Before them, the Tequesta lived here for centuries. It's important to acknowledge that this land is stolen land and that we benefit from that violence. So wherever you're tuning in from, I invite you to take a moment to acknowledge the indigenous caretakers of the land you live and create on as well. Also, I wanted to acknowledge that this has been a difficult year so far for everyone. We're living in the middle of a pandemic. We're having a long overdue confrontation with continuous white supremacist murders of Black citizens, and we're witnessing increased police violence in response to a popular movement. And it feels a little weird that we're getting together tonight to talk about comic books. And it can feel like making comics during this time is indulgent or not helpful. But comics and art and literature in general can be effective tools for communication of ideas and feelings, and are also important as a means of enriching and recharging ourselves. Our creative work has a place alongside our ongoing work for justice, which is good because our work for justice shouldn't and isn't going away anytime soon. If you make comics, or if you want to make comics, or whatever your creative work you do is, I want to encourage you to squeeze in even just a few minutes of time each day to do that work, because we need art and we need literature and we want to read your comics. So thank you for making comics, and thanks for coming to this event tonight. And thanks especially to our presenters who will be sharing tonight. I'm very excited about tonight's event. Nuts and Bolts is a series of programs in which cartoonists who have a connection to South Florida talk about their practical approach to various aspects of making comics. Each session, we bring a group of comics writers and artists together to discuss a single topic. This week, we're talking about story development, and we have some fantastic guests who I'll introduce in the order in which they'll be presenting. Each presentation is approximately 10 minutes. Afterwards, we'll have time for questions and discussion. Your mics are muted for the presentations, and when we get to the conversation portion, you can write your questions in the chat or raise your hand in the participant section of your Zoom screen, and we can unmute you and you can ask your question verbally if you want. Just a disclaimer, some content in this presentation might not be appropriate for all ages. So with that, I'm going to introduce the speakers, and then I'll hand it over to them to do a great presentation tonight. Our first speaker is going to be Jarod Roselló. Jarod is a Cuban-American writer, cartoonist, and teacher. He is the author of the graphic novels Red Panda and Moon Bear, and The Well-Dressed Bear Will Never Be Found. Jarod holds an MFA in creative writing and a PhD in curriculum and instruction, both from Penn State University. Originally from Miami, he now lives in Tampa, Florida, with his family, and teaches in the creative writing program at the University of South Florida. So welcome, Jarod. Following Jarod, will be Jayro Lantigua. Jayro is a Miami-based cartoonist. His work includes Burnt Comics, Hurt, and Smack Rat Alley. Jayro's comics touch on dark themes such as mental illness, suicide, depression, existential dread, paranoia, and more. He masks these themes with humor and anthropomorphic characters that at times appear harmless, but the work is definitely not for kids. Following Jayro will be Remus Jackson. Remus is a genderqueer cartoonist and PhD student in English at the University of Florida. Their work explores trans and disabled embodiment and desire. Their comic, See Me, was awarded a 2019 Prism Award for Best Short Form Comic, and they co-host the comics podcast, Drawing a Dialogue. And then our final presenter tonight will be Jessica Garcia, also known as Miss Jaws. Jessica is an illustrator, animator, zine maker, and fine artist from West Palm Beach, Florida. Since earning her BFA in illustration from Ringling College of Art and Design in 2016, she has emerged as one of South Florida's up-and-coming artists. Her work blends themes of sexuality, struggle, and liberation to tell stories with authenticity and a sense of humor. So welcome, Jessica. Welcome all of the presenters. I'm now going to hand the presentation over to Jarod.
Hi, everybody. Thank you, Neil, and Radiator Comics Studio for hosting this and for getting us all together. It is, as you mentioned, very difficult for some of us to sit down and to make comics and to make art. And I think you're right that we should find those moments and those times that we can to still get together. And I think being able to come together and see our community is part of helping us sort of continue that and remember who are the people that we're responsible to and who's a part of our community and who are the people we're writing for and engaging with. So thank you for hosting us and putting us all together. As Neil mentioned, I am a cartoonist and a writer. My first book, I'm going to talk a little bit just briefly about my process of story development, and then my first book is this one here, The Well-Dressed Bear Will Never Be Found. This was a graphic novel that I did as part of a larger research project. Neil mentioned that I did my PhD in curriculum and instruction. I ran an after-school comics club for about 1.5 years for high school students. And I came in to teach them comics, but they didn't want me to teach them anything. They just wanted to hang out and draw comics. And so I was like, well, what am I supposed to be doing in this research project? And so I just came and I hung out with them and I brought comics and they would talk amongst themselves. And I got to experience this space in which there were all these kinds of conversations happening, and it was all happening in the space of making comics. And I became really interested in those sort of borderlands or liminal spaces. And so I started kind of doodling this sort of bear-human hybrid. And after a while of drawing this character and thinking through what the kids were saying and drawing in my sketchbook, stories started to kind of emerge. My second book, Red Panda and Moon Bear, is a middle grade graphic novel. And like the first one, I sort of was inspired to work on this book after working with young kids, elementary school kids, drawing comics, and was really kind of interested in the ways in which kids construct story, not just as sort of when we're building our story, what logically should happen next, but for kids, whatever they can imagine will happen next. And I was really, I don't know, kind of inspired by how much possibility they seemed to have when they sat down to draw. And I remembered that that's what made me love animation and comics and cartoon characters so much. So when I sat down to draw this book, I spent time working with kids, drawing with my own kids, and really tried to kind of capture some of those spaces. And so for me, story development really begins with character and concept. Before I get to story, before I figure out what's happening, I sit down and I'm drawing in my sketchbook. And so I'm going to share my screen briefly just to show you something, and hopefully this works. Okay, maybe Neil, you could give me a thumbs up if you said, okay, great, perfect. All right, so about a year ago, I started drawing this boy here who had a little puppet on his hand, and the puppet would sort of come to life. And I was really interested in this idea of transformation, where this boy maybe has powers to bring this puppet to life, or could become this kind of, could sort of embody this puppet in some kind of way, and there could be a kind of dual identity there. And I was inspired by my son, who's 4 now, was 3 at the time, but he was really into performing stories. And so when we would read a book, he would act out what was happening. And then he eventually started talking about transforming into the characters of these stories. And so I started doodling this little boy who looks sort of like my son, with a dinosaur puppet. And that sort of advanced into this idea of, so I was still sort of working with this character who had powers of transformation and working with these concepts of transformation. And that sort of morphed into this boy who had the power to transform himself from human into dinosaur, using really just his imagination, his own will. He could sort of will it into existence just by wanting it to be there. And so I had this boy, and I had him transforming into this dinosaur, and I had this imagination-powered abilities. But all of this is still, none of this is still story yet. This is still character. This is still concept. And so I stuck in my sketchbook and drawing my characters, drawing them in different settings and different scenes, trying to listen to what their voices sound like. How do they respond to others? Really, who are they? For me, story emerges from character. And so in order to get to the story, I really felt like I needed to have a sense of who this kid was, who this boy was, and why would he transform anyway in the first place, right? And so I started playing around. Here's a sort of sketch. Hopefully you can see that okay. But a sketch of a story in which he would start to transform, use his powers also on other things around him. And so he could here transform this toy dinosaur into an actual dinosaur by zapping it with his hands, I guess. I don't know, I haven't worked that out entirely. But even still character and concept, but there's still no story there yet. And so as I was working through and doodling in my sketchbook and playing out scenes, I drew this scene in which the dinosaur that he created told him, when I feel angry, I should say that this is a book for young readers, kindergarten through 2nd grade, or about there, that this dinosaur said, when I feel angry, I like to roar. And Oliver, who is in dinosaur form down here at the bottom, said that Mommy and Poppy get upset when I roar. They say, Oliver, you are too loud. And it was in this moment when I was sketching this out where the character and the concept began to reveal a kind of story to me, which is one of my first writing professors, John Dufresne, taught me that plot is motivations in collision. And this was the moment where his motivation to be a dinosaur, his desire to be a dinosaur, collided with his love of his family and his desire to be a human. And this was the moment when I realized, okay, I'm there. I'm at the part where the story can start to come out now. And so I go back to the beginning, and at this stage is when I would sit down and start scripting in text and in a sort of script form. But it's a process of getting to this point here. I'm going to stop sharing this now for a second, but it's a process to getting to that point where I start to see the characters and see, I know conflict is a part of stories, but I'm really interested in characters who desire things. And so what do they want, and why do we want it? What do we hope for? What are we afraid of? What do we need? And when I get to that point, that's when I know that I have a story starting to grow and starting to develop. And it's my job as the writer now to sort of get that character into situations where he has to confront what's going on, where he has to look deeper, where he has to start to ask those questions around him. And so that was, I started sketching that character out in October of 2019 was my first sketch. And I just finished a draft of that story maybe about 2 or 3 weeks ago. So it was an 8 or 9 month process of working through that story and working with those characters. And that's a pretty similar process for me when I'm developing characters. It takes me forever to get to the story part because I'm really stuck on character and concept. And I feel like I really need to know that before I can kind of move on and let the story sort of emerge for itself. Otherwise, one of my very first mini comics I ever made, I got a review on a website, and it was, these characters are perfunctory. And at the time I was like, oh, I've been critiqued. But I really sat with that, and I thought, why these characters and why this story? And that was a really important review that I got for me at that time, as I was, very early into my comics career, but it has really stuck with me to make sure why these characters, why this story, and why now. And so I will, so that's kind of an overview of my process. Lots of sketching in sketchbooks before I even sit down to start thinking about story. And I really want the story to kind of emerge from the characters rather than me forcing a story onto a character. But I'll pause there and we can.
Great, thanks so much, Jarod. So our next presenter is Jayro Lantigua, and we'll turn it over to Jayro.
Hey, how's it going? So I guess just to really touch base on like the kind of comics that I do, if you guys haven't read Burnt or heard or any of that stuff, you know what, I'll share the screen real quick and show some stuff. Let's do that. All right, everybody can see, right? Cool. No? Yeah? All right, great. So this is the cover to Hurt, which was basically, I know it's a little bit graphic and, apologies in advance. The reason being is that Hurt is actually just a series of poems that touched base with depression and a couple other things that I was dealing with. They're slightly personal, and I interpreted those poems later as comics. So I tried to find a visual representation for the, things that I was trying to convey. And ultimately, this is kind of like the end result. So the other thing is, I guess let me just get a little bit into the writing process. So regarding the writing process, for me, it's a little strange in the sense that I have this weird thing where I kind of like to visually tell the story first. So for those that thumbnail here, I'll take it back out real quick and get us back to outside of the screen and back to everybody else. So in a nutshell, what I do is that I visually tell the story by first outlining a couple of things in writing, and then I thumbnail the story out. So what happens is that I'll have an idea or a main plot that I want to convey, and I'll write a couple of things about it that, like certain points that I maybe want to touch on, or, the kind of characters that I want to portray, and I just start visually telling it through thumbnails. Now, character design, all that stuff, I usually kind of go right off and just say, what kind of character do I want to make? And just play with his appearance based on his personality. Now, I know that it's kind of hard, like, hey, how do I manifest a personality, like just out of the blue? For some people, it's hard, and I understand that. And what I usually recommend in that situation is, like, try journaling, like, as that character, or carrying a small conversation as that character. Like, what would that person, want to say? What would they act like? Anything like that. And that's one way of kind of getting into the head of your character. Generally, what I do is I'll, write a small paragraph, and then once I visually tell it, the dialogue in itself and how it leads to that, I just start kind of basing it on what I'm visually seeing with the thumbnails. There's no finite process for me in terms of writing. Like if I'm making a zine, which is a short project, 16, 32 pages, I mean, if it's gags and stuff like that and, jokes, then yeah, you just roll with it and do like one quick page, tell a quick joke from there, get to the point with it. And, if it's 6 panels, great, try to tell your story in 6 panels. But generally when I'm writing, I carry this, I know it looks like a giant spell book or something, but I mean, I carry it around and I'm just jotting stuff down as I go. So, like I'll have stuff here, like, I know this is like nonsensical from like a distance, right? Like no one has that kind of supervision, but, I'll write stuff down and what kind of, gags I'd like to say, what kind of jokes. Otherwise, I would then start doing these thumbnails, which my thumbnails are just messy. It's almost encoded for just my eyes only at that point. Like I'm the only one that makes sense of it because it's out of order, it's out of whack. But yeah, in a nutshell, I come up with the main idea, I visually tell it through thumbnails, and then I start filling in the writing as I go, the dialogue. It helps a lot to read. Reading is imperative. Whether you're telling stories, writing them, drawing them, whatever you're doing, it's imperative to read. It helps your vocabulary. It also gives you kind of like a viewpoint as to what kind of stories you want to tell. What kind of stories do you gravitate to? What kind of stories do you find, hit you the hardest? And things like that also help with your story writing process, because you know you start gravitating towards certain authors and their writing and what kind of, you know, fiction, nonfiction, what kind of writing calls your attention, right? And you can work from there, or you could just, you know, convey different ideas. Sorry, I'm like all over the place. But in a nutshell, you know, like just convey your main ideas and visually tell them. It's hard to say it in to make it that simple, but it's not. You essentially you're trying to kind of find synchronicity between what you're drawing and what you're saying, because a lot of people sometimes will struggle with like drawing a panel and maybe at that moment what they wanted to say doesn't really sync, you know, it doesn't really, there's no harmony between the actual panel itself and the dialogue. And that's a challenge for a lot of people when it comes to sequential storytelling. But finding the characters and, you know, what works for you. For example, in a lot of the things that I draw, like Smack Rat Alley and things like that, I find myself using a lot of slang or concepts from like the beatnik generation. So, you know, I borrow a lot from like the beats. Like I'll say, instead of saying, oh, that guy ratted me out, like, yeah, he grassed on me, or, you know, calling someone a square and stuff like that. Like these are all just, you know, part of that, those terms from that era. And it works for me. You know, I've always been very fond of beat writing, like William S. Burroughs and stuff like that. So I try to gravitate towards, you know, using that funny lingo sometimes for certain characters. And it kind of adds a little bit of edge to it in the sense, like, you know, it's not a common, you know, it's not a common way of talking that people see anymore. But for the same cartoons and the kind of humor that I do, you know, I find it a little bit more, you know, appealing to make it funnier and not as modern in terms of the way people talk and stuff like that. You know, like I wouldn't have characters like dabbing or doing anything like that because it just doesn't really flow with like what I'm trying to convey. I feel like there would probably be more said if there were questions. I have no idea. Like if there's anybody with a question or anything like that, I could probably go off that better. Or not. I mean, that's fine.
Well, we can, I mean, if anybody does have a question for Jayro, we can take it now, or if you want, we can like do all the questions at the end, or?
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay. Cool. Thanks so much.
No problem.
Let's see. So next we have Remus Jackson, and I'm gonna unmute you.
Cool. Hi. Hopefully everything will be okay. My Wi-Fi is a little unstable, so if I start to cut out, just grab my attention and I will do what I can to sort of correct that. But I'm actually going to start by sharing my screen because I have a PowerPoint because I'm a teacher and it sort of live with PowerPoints. Let me just present. So, hi, I'm Remus. I wanted to actually start before I sort of move into the development stuff with a couple examples of my work. Just to kind of show I kind of do a range of things. Like Neil said, I'm a graduate student, which means I don't have a lot of time to do stuff as much now as I used to do, which has been helpful in a way because it's pushed me to be a lot more like experimental and less precious about the things I do. So I have sort of some examples of more zine-y things that are a little bit messier, and then something that's a little more polished. Those pages on the right are from the We're Still Here All Trans anthology. Before I talk about, and then sort of like before I kind of like, to start, I guess, let's say, I tend to like position myself as thinking as like, what sort of influences am I coming from, right? So I pull from a wide variety of influences. Like Jayro said, reading is super important. I pull from like a bunch of different types of media, so literature, but also like film, manga, comics, zines, theoretical texts, and my own personal experiences. And everything I do is sort of rooted in those things. Sometimes a direct response, as I'll show, and then a lot of times just sort of like, oh, this is a vibe that I find really interesting, or like I'm thinking about in my own work. The way that I work is super chaotic because I have a very chaotic I have to sort of organize my disorganized brain. And I actually picked up on this from a teacher I had for a creative nonfiction class I took, where she said that she just collects fragments of writing. And so I kind of just heap things, constantly collect things. So my notes app is literally like 20 pages of just like anything that pops into my head. I draw a lot in my notes app with the touchpad. So if I have like something in my head I'm thinking about and I don't want to lose it, I do this at night a lot. When I'm in bed about to fall asleep and I'm like, I've got it. And I also use a program called Scrivener, which is what I do all of my writing in. And I like it because it lets you sort of have like binders and you can organize in the binders. And so you can see I sort of do a similar thing where I just have all these documents in Scrivener. And a lot of these are just like 2 sentences that I've like just given myself to sort of come back to later. And then sort of from there, in terms of building out, my process is about 80% thinking and 20% actually doing writing or drawing. I build that, like, no matter what I'm doing, I have to build in like a lot of like months sometimes of just like letting myself think and like letting myself really think through something. And my main things I think about are, what is the feeling I want to get at? That's a huge one for me. I tend to think about stories more in terms of like, what's the feeling I want, as opposed to like, like plot or character even. Also, what am I pulling from or putting myself in conversation with? Like most of my work sort of draws from my personal experiences, being trans, being disabled. Even if it's not, I don't do a lot of autobio. I do a lot of stuff that is like adjacent to autobio or fictionalized autobio or like wink, wink, nudge, nudge, but not actually autobio. I also am putting things in conversation a lot of the time with like other trans cartoonists, right? Or things that I encountered, going back to sort of that map of influences. And then I also think about, even from the start, like, where do I see it? Like, if this is, like, if I want to do something self-published, which I mostly do, or if it's like, I know someone is doing like a call for a type of comic, do I want to pitch it to someone? Do I have a friend who's publishing that I kind of want to like get in with? And obviously that's very flexible, because like sometimes I'll be like, oh, I want to pitch this, and then, the pitch doesn't get accepted or whatever, and then I'm like, okay, then I'll just make it for myself. But just sort of having that in the back of my head as I work is helpful, because it helps shape sort of like what choices I want to make. Because if I'm making something for myself that's very like self-published, I tend to be like a lot more experimental, because I don't have to like answer to someone, right? And obviously there's pros and cons to everything. So I just sort of like think about that. And then also lots and lots of doodling and sketching. I used to be a big sketchbook person. I am no longer a big sketchbook person, unfortunately, but I have an iPad, and I basically draw everything in the iPad. And I have a bunch of documents in iPad that are just like layers and layers of doodles that I kind of come to when I'm thinking through things. So I thought it would be interesting to sort of share as like an example of this process, like something that I'm working on that's like, I started working on it last year and it didn't really go anywhere, and I've been thinking about picking it up again. So this is still very early stages of development. But I like it because I actually started it in response to, I took a class last fall semester on queer, trans, and feminist film. And for my final paper, I wrote about the game show Are You the One? The queer season of Are You the One? And as I was sort of working on that, like, these are all my notes where I was sort of thinking through what I wanted to write about in like the academic text I was pulling from. I started thinking about like, what would sort of my like comic version of this be? And so that then moved into some notes for myself about like, if I was going to make a comic about Ato or Are You the One, what would I then do? And then that sort of built out into something about like, how do you escape this logic of queer representation? Like, where's the, if I'm arguing in the paper that the show sort of forecloses certain things of queer representation, then what can I do in a comic that sort of opens those avenues back up? And then that turned into a lot of doodling. So you can sort of see, like, I have these very rough sketches of character ideas. It's a game show. So I was like, I need an ensemble cast. So I just sort of drew a whole bunch of people, and then it sort of starts to come together into more cohesive character designs, like things that are more solidified, but still very like exploratory. I'm still just sort of playing around. And like I said, this isn't like a finished, I wanted to share this actually because it's so early on. So then like my next step, I have an outline. My next step is going to be sort of coming back to the outline now that I've literally had a half a year to think about it. and starting to like edit that and play with that and see what adjustments, and sort of moving back and forth, thinking about what things I might want to respond to differently now, what feelings I'm going for. I've been thinking about a lot because with all the protests going on and the conversations about abolition, and I'm an abolitionist, this is sort of like a project I think of as a very like abolitionist oriented project. So that's sort of why it's been on my mind lately. Yeah, the sort of with me, like I'm, like I said, I have a very disorganized brain, and I always say like try to figure out what works for you in your brain, because I teach writing to undergraduates, and a lot of the time they're just like, oh, I'm not good at writing, or I don't know how to write, and it's usually because like they think there's only one process, and we have to sort of work on like, are you a visual thinker, are you a kinesthetic thinker, are you an audio thinker, do you like working in this program, do you like working in this program, do you need to handwrite stuff? So sort of like figuring out what things work and don't work. And for me, that's a lot of organized chaos. It's limiting pressure for me to feel like I have to make things that are like complete looking, because that like stresses me out too much. I was, returning back to those roots, those influences a lot, and, finding new things, connecting with other people's work, figuring out like, who am I in conversation with? If I'm not in conversation with anyone, is there someone I should be in conversation with? That kind of thing. And then also like a big thing for me is getting feedback. So feedback from colleagues, feedback from friends. When I lived in Providence, we had a cartoonist writing group where like once a week we would meet up and take turns sharing material and give each other feedback. I still constantly am in the habit of like sending rough drafts and sketches and things like that to my friends and just sort of talking through things. And I find all of that to be like really useful and helpful in terms of developing. So yeah, I will stop sharing now and hand it off to the next person. Yes, Lieutenant.
That was great. Thanks so much, Remus. And so now our final presenter for the evening is Jessica Garcia, who I'm unmuting. I think I'm unmuting. Are you there? Yeah. Okay,
can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Okay, hi everyone. My name's Jessica. I feel really lucky to have heard everyone's presentations first, because now I can just cheat off of all of you. I actually want to go back really quick to what Neil was saying in the beginning. I thought his opening was really nice, and he had made a comment about how it might feel a little weird right now to be talking about art with everything that's going on. Like it's a little whimsical, it's a little, maybe you feel like you're distracted from like what's going on, but I just want to say that art is something that can be purposeful and revolutionary during this time. Who knows, maybe the things you learn from this lesson from our talks about story development, you can put out the good word about what's going on. Listening to Jarod and Jayro and Remus, they all had things that they were kind of hitting on. Jarod's service to kids, Jayro's talking about mental health, Remus is talking about trans and disabled issues or concerns, and I think those are all really important. So it does have a purpose. It is prevalent. It is to the point. And with that, I'm gonna get into my stuff. I feel definitely out of place compared to everyone else. I consider myself an illustrator first and foremost. Illustration is narrative, so I feel like comics are just kind of the long form of that. So I guess I want to talk about my personal method, because as someone who doesn't consider themselves a writer, I'll run on and on and on and on. Like I was never known for my writing merits or anything of the sort. So the methods that I kind of came up with to be able to tell stories was sort of a combination of drawing and writing at the same time. So I actually want to share my screen with y'all really quick. And can you guys see everything still? Neil, can you let me know if my screen is on?
Yes, it looks good.
Okay, perfect. So actually really related to Remus, my first example, I write in notes too. I write in notes all the time, and I'll write phrases or ideas just to start. And from there, I will create the whole piece based on that. So if you look at like my, oops, I hit the wrong thing. Okay, sorry guys. If you look at my sketchbooks as well, I should be back on. Sorry guys. So if you look at my sketchbooks too, I hope you can see. It's a ton of writing. It's messy. There's writings, there's drawings. It's kind of just a mismatch. Pretty chaotic with my process. So I'm either doing notes online or on my phone or on my computer, or I'm writing it down in my sketchbook. I'm usually starting with a small phrase. Other times I'll have something a little longer. I'll show you an example of that. So this was, so this was a full, like, I took a scan of my sketchbook because I knew it'd be impossible to see over the screen, but I did it anyway for some reason. I had written down the whole dialogue for my comic, and it had all this just like irrelevant information. Like it's, so I had all this stuff written out, and when I finally went into the drawing phase, I had to start cutting down, and how I was able to do that in the first place was to start drawing it. Once I start drawing what I'm doing, I can pace myself and I can see how the pacing is going with my writing. Like I said, I'm not a writer, so sometimes I realize after I start drawing, I'm like, this is looking really repetitive, or this is just completely off the point, like has nothing to do with what's going on, and I'm not staying on theme anymore. So it's almost like a combination of storyboarding with my writing, just because I'm also a very visual person. Just to think it all up in my head and then write script and things like that, that just doesn't work for me because that's never how I worked before. I was usually like, you know, it was a one central piece, and there goes a lot of planning to that too, and a lot of like, not writing, but like a lot of planning, but visual planning, like thumbnails, roughs, and things like that. And that's just the same with my comics, just adding some dialogue here and there. There are other times where I will start with a visual. I'll show you that. So I started this whole thing, like I said, I'm an illustrator. I had just this one illustration. And I was like, okay, I like this and I want to build on this. And when I had first started, I added this panel and this panel. And then I was like, okay, the pacing's not quite there. I want to add some more. So I started adding this sort of subplot of it getting a little more mystical and kind of far out, a little more goofy. And then again, I was like, well, I can't go from this to an end. I need to add some more substance, some more plot to it. Like, because especially with humor, I feel like there has to be a pretty decent pacing. You can't just like move too quickly or move too slowly. Otherwise, like you miss the punchline or you're leading up so much that it just doesn't matter anymore. You just want to be over with it. So to have this story kind of in 3 parts, it's a very simple, but again, for someone who doesn't consider themselves like a writer or a comic book artist, for me, this was like the easiest way to start getting into it. Just short form, really simple. That was an older piece too, I should add, but I guess a way to feel like you don't have to start doing like 16, 20, 32 pages, something really, really intense and committed, because I'm also someone who has a really hard time sticking to long projects. Like I've seen webcomics that go on for years and years and series and things like that. And that's beautiful. And if you can, do it. If that's what you want, do it. But like, for me, I like to work quick. I like to dish out the next idea. I like to move on. I like to get my message out there fast. So, and which is why I like the zine format as well, because it's a little more abstract. You can get like goofy with it. It can kind of go in different places. It could be an anthology where like the story breaks up into different parts. So yeah, I guess I feel bad because like everyone here is like these long form, like really structured comic book artists. And I'm kind of here to mess it up and be like, hey guys, I'm like this total like, you know, folk artist, kind of just hanging out, trying different things and new things. But I kind of just want to say like, it's accessible. Like if you're not a writer, if you're not someone who's like an expert, like you can definitely still get into it and you come up with your own method. I draw and write at the same time. I'm like storyboarding as I'm like coming up with the story, and I go, oh wait, that panel doesn't make sense, or you know, what have you. So, and it helps me come up with, especially when I'm doing something a little more poetic, something a little more abstract, where it's like not a physical narrative like conversation or something like that, when it's a more personal work where the illustration isn't so representative. How should I put this? Like something more poetic, or where it's metaphors, or it's I guess we'll say metaphorical. It's abstract. It's not representative of what's going on. You're not seeing like two people walk, or a character necessarily that is like in a tangible universe and stuff like that. You can kind of, as you're storyboarding and writing, you can come up with different visuals that will give your words more impact. You know what I'm saying? So I know I keep going on and off screen, but it's because I'm all over the place. So y'all gonna have to bear with me. One example of this is a comic that I haven't finished yet. This is one that I have planning. And I hope you can see my sketches. I scanned these beforehand, and I'm hoping they come through. So this was a sketch that I did a little while ago. I think this was last year. And it was a phrase that my mother had told me, and I legitimately started with it as a Post-it note in my sketchbook. And it says, if you lack wisdom, pray for it. Don't pray for patience. If you ask for patience, you're asking to be tested. So I was coming up with the visuals for this, and as I was drawing and planning this out, I took this phrase and I was like, how can I kind of show this visually? And on the right-hand side was like my initial ending, which was like where you're being tested. It's like the gas running empty on your car. And I went back to it and I was like, well, you know, I don't know if that's what I want. And I tried again. And in this one, once again, forgive my sketchy nature, but this is, instead of the gauge being on E, it's the computer crashing and papers being thrown on the side in the inbox panel on the side. Now, whether, you know, which one's the better option, that's kind of up to me to decide, and I'm still thinking about that, because, you know, I may come up with a totally different solution. But that's how I'm able to use that in my to my advantage, because then I can go, okay, I like how, you know, the car stopping out on them looks good, but, you know, it's also really frustrating when you're at work, and that's also a really crazy time. Like, what are two like frustrating scenarios that like test your patience? Your car breaking down and work. So, and just seeing how those visually compare with, you know, your theme, the feeling that you're trying to get across. So yeah, I mean, I mostly just wanted to share my way of doing it, kind of the messy, disorganized way that I like to work. And, you know, it's not for everyone. It works for me. And I would say the important thing too, and why I do it, is just for cohesion's sake, to make sure that my story stays semi-cohesive, so that I have visual impact when I do my stuff. And I basically was able to choose the right option, and also for efficiency, because now I storyboarded and thumbed out my comic and I've killed two birds with one stone. And like I said, I like to move projects fast. I like to, especially when I'm working with humor, like they're quick gags. Like it shouldn't take that much, build up or time. So I like to, put out lots of things at once and then kind of bring them all together into an anthology. So yeah, that's me.
Well, thanks so much, Jessica. Those are all really fantastic presentations. It was really great seeing everybody's different processes. So we have, about 20 minutes for conversation. If anybody has questions, you can either type it in the chat or in the participants section, there's a blue hand that you can raise if you want. And it looks like actually we already have a question. So we'll open this up to Liz. Welcome, Liz.
Hi, I'm Liz. I use she, her pronouns. I am a cartoonist based in the Boston area of Massachusetts. I have a question for Remus. I'm a huge fan of yours and Kathy's podcast, Drawing a Dialogue. Do you have any plans in the future of any inspiration from your life working in the podcast or anything like that, or as an educator? Just curious.
Oh, that's a good question. I mean, I feel like we're always sort of playing around with the format of the podcast. But it is, I do think a lot about how to sort of bring those together, because I don't know, it's weird because I tend to sort of view my work as a little bit disjointed from being an educator, partially because I'm an educator in the sense that I'm a graduate student who teaches, and it's a little bit different than being like Kathy, my co-host, who is a actual teacher in a class. I'm in a class. How do I say? She works at a school. I'm sort of here as it's just a slightly different relationship. But I don't know. I mean, it's definitely something I think if I was gonna do something like that, it would be more as an academic book and less as a comic thing. But I think a lot of what we talk about on the podcast ends up bleeding into my own work anyway. We talk about queer representation, we talk about trans stuff, we talk about disability, we talk about abolition. It all sort of ends up cross-feeding anyway, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And thank you, everyone. You all have really cool writing techniques, so yay. Thank you so much for this. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Liz. I have a bunch of questions, but I was wondering if any of the panelists wanted to ask any questions of each other. And I'm pretty sure you can unmute yourself. If not, we can. Okay. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
I don't have a question, but I did want to say, Jessica, that I don't think you should feel bad about sharing your process, because literally your method of working is so cool and useful to me. Not to me, but it's so cool and useful, and I find it super cool. As a person who has deliberately spent the last 5 years trying to unlearn everything I was taught about how to make stuff.
Yeah.
So, thank you for sharing. I just think it's a really cool way of working.
Thank you. Yeah, no, I really related to what you had going on. As soon as I saw the iPhone notes, I was like,
yep,
they get me. This is it.
I'll jump in also and say that I appreciate you sharing too, Jessica, that idea of doing things kind of quickly too. There are times where if you're working on a long project, you can start to feel really burned out. And sometimes being able to just move quickly without so much planning and just whatever emerges on the page can be really kind of affirming for your process, and you can surprise yourself. I think there's something spontaneous that happens in those moments. And I think the pages that you showed and the images that you showed are really great examples of how art making is kind of emergent and performative and happens in the moment that you're doing it too, even if you've planned in advance. But so I'm glad that you shared that too, because I think that a lot of people that'll resonate with a lot of people's process.
Thank you. Yeah, with what you just said, Jared, I that's something that I struggle with, is staying on focus. You guys, there's, you know, something that I saw with a lot of you guys was that you guys have more long-term projects and you're able to stick with your narrative or like build on it really well. And I guess this is a question for all three of you, because you guys all work in a longer format. I guess, how do you stay on focus with your narrative and your theme and what you're trying to portray? So I'll start with Jayro and Jayro and Remus if you want to add as well.
All right.
Sure, yeah. I think by nature, I'm kind of patient, especially when it comes to art making. I like sort of being able to sit with something sort of delicately and very slowly as I work through it. And so the process of cartooning is a very rewarding one for me in many ways, because it's so long and tedious. And so I don't mind that. I also jump around a lot. And so I bounce around between projects a lot. Like I'll read 10 books at once. I'll be drawing 10 different things at once, which slows me down even more, but it also helps me kind of keep seeing the thing that I'm looking at with kind of fresh eyes, but also in relation to things that I think are important, or things that as I think Remus had mentioned, keeping in mind the things that you want to be in conversation with. And so I bounce around a lot, but I also don't mind sort of just sitting and working a little at a time on something, picking away at something over a couple of years. And so.
I mean, generally with my process, like I bounce from project to project, kind of like what Jared was mentioning. The thing with me is that I get profoundly bored, like of one project, like way too quick. Like it just happens to me all the time, where like I'll work on something, and you know, those first few days that you're in it, you're like, man, I really, you know, I'm really digging this project. But then like come like the fourth day, I'm like, man, screw it, I don't want to do this anymore. And it happens all the time, right? Like I just get like, I hate feeling complacent with just like, you know, staying in one project, and it happens a lot. But you know, essentially it's just a matter of staying focused and just being disciplined. But I'm on the same page with constantly wanting to fill up my stuff with like one-page gags or jokes, because it's like I said, it's a way to kind of, you know, take focus off the major work that I might be working on right then and there. But it's also good to just, you know, bring a little bit of something in that's different from the key story that, you know, might serve as like a break to someone who's reading. And, you know, to Remus's point earlier, it's important to actually take your ideas and stuff and, you know, bounce it off other people sometimes. And it's not just, you know, and here's the thing, a lot of artists and writers have this issue where they'll surround themselves with, I guess the best way to label it would be like yes men, like people that just are like, yeah, it's totally awesome, it's amazing. Like, you don't want to be around that. That's toxic. Like you don't grow. You know what I'm saying? You want to be around people that say, hey, it sucks, but I'm going to explain why it sucks, and like give you like, you know, constructive feedback. And it's not always about like hearing compliments. Like and you know, pardon my French and all, but I really don't give a shit about compliments. Like I really want to hear like what it is that you read that sucks, why, and how could it like have, you know, gravitated more towards you. How did you like it, you know? And that's the thing, like it's important to grow by, you know, having a sense of community around you to bounce ideas off, kind of like what we have going on right here. That's great. And also to just, you know, always challenge your work. Like if I know some people say don't overthink it, but you know, there's times where it kind of calls for it. And yeah, just, you know, one project at a time, just do the best you can and just jump on it. But it's been fun just hearing everybody's process, like, you know, how different it is for everybody and the different approaches it takes. There's really no right answer.
Yeah, I think like in my case, to sort of piggyback also off of what Jayro just said, because I saw there's a comment asking about critique groups too. So working with other people and getting feedback is like a really important thing. I used, like I said, I briefly mentioned, I used to be part of like a more formal working group, and now I have like a writing group with my academic colleagues, and actually sometimes I'll make them look at my comic stuff because they have like, they do comic studies, but they're not artists, so like they can be really useful as like outside perspectives of like, how does this read to you? But like I also, like a lot of my friends who are also cartoonists or who are also working are also really good editors, and so like, yeah, it's about getting sort of that. I love critique. So it's definitely about getting some of that, like good critique about like, how can you, like, what is working, what isn't working. I'm terrible at pacing. I'm terrible at structure. So those are usually my biggest, like, please tell me how this isn't working. And they'll be like, oh, you're missing a beat here. Or like, this doesn't read because like you've jumped to this part. And I'm like, okay, cool. So definitely working with critique groups is super functional. And in terms of like working on long projects, I'm also a pretty impatient person, but I've just sort of been forced to work slowly, because like I started school and I don't have time to work anymore. And I consider myself really lucky if I can draw once a month. And so like by virtue of those obligations, it has forced me. And in a way that's been very helpful because I kind of mentioned, like, I am very impatient. So I think in a way it's actually been very healthy for me to sort of learn how to take it in little pieces and spend time on things long term.
Nice. Yeah, and I wanted to make sure that Tim's question was asked, and it's been touched on a little bit. But Tim Canny writes in the chat: do any of the presenters work with critique partners or critique groups when writing, or does the intertwining of drawing and writing make that unworkable?
I guess I could add to that. I don't work with any critique partners or groups. It's really just, you know, random friends and stuff that sometimes I'll bring it up to. I mean, obviously they have like some credibility with reading and writing that they can give real feedback versus like, hey, that's awesome, you know. But it's a little hard because, at least for my process, like earlier what I was mentioning, like I convey like a main idea or something on a paragraph, and then I visually thumb that out, like thumbnailing it out, which just for the sake of clarity, like thumbnailing is like very rough, like tiny panel sketches, or, you know, like large or whatever, you know, like just you're trying to convey the idea visually and you're just making like a small draft of it. So I try to thumbnail the story through, and that process, those notes, unfortunately, they're a little hard to, you know, to read and just interpret, because those are notes that are mainly for myself. So it would be hard for me to like just show notes and get feedback on it so much as it is that I would actually have to sit down one-on-one with whomever I'm speaking with and just like, you know, give my story and points verbally, because yeah, just what I'm doing on paper essentially is just for me. I don't know if anybody wants to like add to that or.
Yeah, I was just gonna say that I don't have a critique group. I actually like to talk to a lot of non-artists when I show my work, just because I feel like, disclaimer, I don't mean to say that they're simple or dumb, but it's just like if it's not obvious, like they'll let you know, like I don't get it, because that kind of critical thinking isn't necessarily there. And this is not to say that they're dumb or anyone who isn't an artist is dumb, but sometimes it's like that, like art kid, like fine art school facade is kind of gone, and it's just like either I get it or I don't. So if someone who isn't an artist like they get what I'm trying to say, then I know that I've kind of done a good job because I can reach across the board. And then the general person that I will bring it to is my husband, because he's a pretty good writer. So if he's just like, this doesn't make sense, or like you're running on or something like that, he's the closest I have to a critique group. Other than that, like, you know, a couple friends here and there, but generally I like showing to non-artists just because they're pretty blunt about it.
Yeah, I also do not have a formal critique group or partner or anything. But I like to show people stuff that I'm working on as I'm working on it. So I do a lot of comics for kids now. And so I'll pop into, like, when I visit a classroom, I'll bring a story I just wrote a draft of and I'll share it with kids. And they're very honest about what jokes are funny and which ones are not funny. And they have tons of suggestions for better jokes than the ones you wrote. So I'll do things like that. I have a couple friends too, where if I'm really uncertain about something, I'll call and say, hey, let me bounce some ideas off of you, or check this out and tell me what you think, but nothing formalized.
Cool. I wanted to ask, like, you know, story development is kind of this like, it's a step that not a lot of people think about when you think about comics. Like, people talk about writing, people talk about drawing or inking. And I was just wondering if, is story development a discrete step in your process for making comics, that like at some point you mark as done? Or, I guess for some of you, sort of in your presentations showed that it is sort of like a continuous process, but like, is making changes to the story as you continue to write and draw the comic something that you work into your work?
Yeah, so changing the story around and story development is just a constant process. At least for like when I'm drawing or something like that. Like, I might have a page that, I'll come up to a certain point in the story and I want to convey this idea or take the plot in this direction. And if I'm not 100% with it, or I'm just, there's something there that I feel like it just needs to be desired, I sit on it for a day or two. I'll just sit on it for a day or two, think about it, and really evaluate what other directions I could take with my story. There's been times where like I've gone to a page later on and realized like, crap, I hate exactly where the story is going at this point, and I really want to change it. And I'll that might even alter the ending, the outcome, or the overall story itself from that point. But it's a constant change in process. I don't think anybody ever really goes in like 100% confident that like that first thing they came up with is just going to be like the final product. I mean, if they do, hey, great. Like that's a gift within itself. But yeah, I just, generally it's a changing thing, and it's always good to run it by people as you go, because you never know. Like, essentially, you're not the only one reading it. Other people are going to read it, and the feedback from other people is essential in a lot of ways. Like, granted, they don't, put the complete say in it, but if there's a point, like, you bring up two options, like, hey, I want to take it down this avenue or that avenue. It's not, it doesn't hurt to just ask around, like, hey, what do you guys think? Do you like this more? Do you dig this more? And just play off that, But that's really just how it is. It's just a changing process, like, the whole time. It's just kinetic the whole way through.
Yeah, I agree. I think it is a kind of a process for me, and I think when you're working with editors of anthologies or at publishers, they want to know that you know what your story is before they sign off on anything. And so it's a skill that at some point, if you're working in those fields, that you'll have to develop. Like, okay, I'm going to sit down, I'm going to write this story out, and it's, kind of like a promise, like, okay, I think I can do this, but I don't have like an art background, and I oftentimes write stuff that I cannot draw, and I don't figure that out until I sit down and try to draw the thing. And so in my first book, I had a traffic jam scene, and I got there and I was like, there's no way I'm drawing this. And so I just changed the story so that it had taken place after a kind of apocalyptic revolution and there were no more cars anymore. And so my inability to draw cars fundamentally altered that story. And I think, all art is constraint based, and your drawing skills and your time are two of your materials that go into that. So yeah, I plan stories and I mark it, as you said, Neil, kind of done. But when I'm drawing it, inevitably I have to make changes to it. And thank God I'm writing then for myself to draw, because then who cares? I can change whatever I want. But yeah.
Yeah, I would say the same. I mean, especially with my process, like I'll hit something and I'll think I like really found it. I'm like, this is it, guys. This is the story of a lifetime. And then as I'm drawing it out, or like as I'm continuing to write or beef it up, I'm just like, there's really not much more here. Like, what can I, like, it's not working anymore. I'll give you an example of what not to do. I was really ambitious my freshman year of college, and me and my roommate were like, let's start a webcomic. And we started drawing characters. We started coming up with these storylines, but they were so specific that there was just no way that we could build that as a continuous story, because we just pigeonholed every single character we had drawn, because we were so focused on just one part of the planning that we thought was said and done, that when it came to the point where we had to actually like keep this ongoing as a project, it just wasn't possible, because we had planned really hard on one part and thought that was it, that we were done, and it completely fell apart once we tried to bring it to the table for a much longer period of time. So yeah, I think it keeps going. You find better ways to say what you want to say. You find better ways to visualize what you want people to see, and yeah, I think if you just stop at your first idea, you're really limiting yourself, because I think you should, explore what you're making and like what's going on, especially if you find a better way to tell the story. Like, you definitely shouldn't be like, well, I already planned it out this way, so we're done here. So
Yeah, I feel like everyone has sort of covered the way I feel. It's just that it's very much ongoing. I'm like, when I say I'm a bad writer, I don't mean I'm bad at writing as in like the content I produce so much as I mean the actual physical act of writing I'm very bad at. It's like, so I tend to kind of figure things out as I go in a way that is not maybe the most useful or productive. But it is a lot of like as much prep work before getting to that point is really helpful. I think I tend to do more like Jared said, the like you sort of have to, you sort of like say like, okay, check, I'm done. But then obviously as you work, then things start to change. And I mean, like, for instance, I've been working on a pitch for a graphic novel for 3 years now, and it has like every time I'm like, check, I'm done, I'm like, actually no, I'm not, because I'll get feedback and have to sort of adjust and things like that. So yeah, it's just sort of ongoing forever.
Cool. We're just about out of time, but I wanted to check to see if any of the panelists wanted to have any like closing thoughts after this conversation. And if not, that's okay too. Cool. Well, after that awkward silence, I want to thank everyone for joining us today. I'm going to be pasting links for the presenters in the chat, and encourage you, oh, that formatting is a little weird. Encourage you to follow those links. They'll also be pasted into the YouTube description when this is posted on YouTube. Jarod is going to be teaching a free online workshop called Telling Our Own Stories for Children of All Ages through the Miami Book Fair online on June 20th from 2 to 3:30 p.m. The Spanish edition of his book, Red Panda and Moon Bear, comes out in July. And Jarod is also running an ongoing jam comic on Twitter, hosted by the children's literature website All the Wonders, and you can go to allthewonders.com for information on how to participate. I strongly encourage you to check out Jessica's website and social media for new art. If you're not already, you'll become a big fan. Jayro is working currently on an experimental graphic novel along with his friend Carmichael Jones, and is also working on his project Iggy and Crush, and I encourage you to look out for that. And I am also, as Liz was stated, a personal fan of Remus's podcast, which they host with Kathy G. Johnston, Drawing a Dialogue, which is available wherever you get your podcasts. So our next Nuts and Bolts is June 30th, at which Drew Lerman, Jamila Rouser, Luke Stewart, and the writing team Bear and Bee will be discussing specifically their writing process for comics. And we're scheduling more programming like this for July. And every Friday, we host a drop-in open studio work session from 4 to 6 p.m. For you to make time for your comics. All the information for that can be found at radiatorcomics.com/studio. Lastly, Radiator Comics Studio is a community project, so it only works with the involvement of the community. So I encourage you to join in on more programming, get in touch. We want to know who's making comics and who wants to make comics in South Florida. And we're always open to new programming ideas. My email address is neil@radiatorcomics.com. And there's a contact form on our website. You can find us on social media. And thanks again to everybody for coming out tonight. And thanks so much to Jessica, Remus, Jayro, and Jarod for your presentations. Thanks, everybody.